My name is Miriam Voss, and I was 34 years old the morning my sister called to ask me to pretend, in front of her future in-laws and their entire social circle, that we had never met. Not to skip the wedding, not to sit in the back, to introduce myself as a family friend, to let strangers shake my hand and ask how I knew the bride and smile and say, "Oh, we go way back. Just not as sisters." She said it in the particular reasonable voice she uses when she's already decided something and is hoping I'll make it easy. Just tell people you're a family friend. The Kingsleys have standards. You know how you are. I said I'd think about it. What I was actually thinking about in the 7 seconds of silence that followed was a document, a title deed, my name on the first line, followed by the legal address of the Hartwell property, the estate grounds where her ceremony was booked, where the Kingsleys had already paid a deposit, where every chair and floral arrangement and catering tent was scheduled to arrive in 11 days. I own that property. I have owned it for 3 years. And not one person in my family had thought to mention that detail to the Kingsleys. What happened on the morning of that wedding is something I've replayed more times than I can count. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where quiet people own the ground others stand on. If you're new here, hit subscribe. And if someone's ever asked you to make yourself smaller to fit their story, drop a comment. I need to hear from you. Before I tell you about the phone call, I need to tell you about the property. Because the property is the reason any of this is possible, and the property has a history that belongs to someone else before it belongs to me. And if I skip that part, you'll think this is a story about real estate. It isn't. It's a story about what it costs to be invisible in your own family for long enough that they forget to check what's in your name. My name is Miriam Voss. I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, the older of 2 daughters. My parents ran a small accounting practice together out of a converted Victorian on the north side of town. My father handled business clients. My mother handled estates and trusts. It was, by most measures, a practical and stable upbringing. We were not wealthy. We were not struggling. We were the particular kind of comfortable that middle-class professional families achieve and then spend considerable energy maintaining, which means money was always present as a topic but rarely discussed directly, and the expectation was that both daughters would go to college, become something legible, and not require assistance past the age of 22. My sister Delia is 3 years younger than me. She has always been the more vivid version of a Voss daughter, louder, funnier, more at ease in social situations, the kind of person who walks into a room and orients it around herself without appearing to try. Growing up, I understood this about her, without resenting it, the way you understand weather. She was the one our parents called first when they had news. She was the one their friends asked about. She was the one who got the longer story at Christmas dinners. I was the one who fixed the printer and remembered birthdays and quietly handled the things that needed handling without being asked. These are not complaints. I'm describing a system. Systems have consequences, and one consequence of ours was that by the time I was 30, my family had developed the habit of not quite seeing me. Not maliciously, but completely the way you stop seeing furniture you've had for years. I studied landscape architecture at NC State, and then completed a graduate certificate in historic property management, which is a niche field that most people have never heard of and which I find genuinely fascinating. Historic property management sits at the intersection of preservation law, land use, environmental compliance, and estate administration. It requires a working knowledge of deed records, title history, easement documentation, and the particular regulatory landscape that governs properties listed on state or national historic registers. I work for a firm in Asheville that contracts with estates, trusts, and private owners to manage historic properties, overseeing maintenance schedules, tenant agreements, compliance documentation, capital improvement planning. I am good at it. I am precise and thorough, and I understand paperwork the way other people understand music. The anchor of my family, in every sense that matters, was my great-uncle Roland. He was my maternal grandmother's brother, which placed him technically at the edge of our family tree, but he had been a constant presence since before I was born. Roland had never married, had no children, and had spent his professional life as a county land surveyor in Buncombe County for 38 years. He retired at 67 with a surveyor's pension, a modest investment account, and something no one in the family had thought much about: the Hartwell property. The Hartwell property is 15 acres of historic farmland on the western edge of Asheville, bordering a state greenway. The original structure, a Georgian Revival farmhouse built in 1887, sits at the center of the acreage, surrounded by formal gardens that Roland had maintained with the same methodical precision he'd brought to survey work. The property had been in his family since the 1940s, acquired by his father during a period when such acquisitions were possible for a working family with patience and discipline. Roland had inherited it in 1979, managed it himself for decades, and eventually, as he got older, allowed a local events company to use the grounds for weddings and outdoor ceremonies on a seasonal rental basis. The income was modest. The property itself, by the time I came into his life professionally, had been appraised at somewhere between $800,000 and $1 million, depending on the year and the methodology. He never talked about that number. He talked about the drainage easement on the south field and whether the boxwood hedges along the east garden wall were getting enough water. I met Roland properly, not as a child at family gatherings, but as an adult with something in common when I was 27 and he was 79. I had just started at my firm, and one of my senior colleagues mentioned that a client they'd been working with informally, a retired surveyor with a historic farmstead outside Asheville, was looking for someone to help him get his property documentation in order. His existing records were meticulous in the surveying sense but incomplete in the preservation compliance sense, and he needed someone who could build out a proper management file, review the easement documentation, and get the property correctly registered with the State Historic Office. My colleague passed along his number. I called. We met at the property on a Wednesday afternoon in October, and within 20 minutes I understood two things: that Roland was the sharpest 80-year-old I had ever met, and that this property was extraordinary. I spent 8 months doing the documentation work he'd hired me for, building the management file, navigating the state historic registry process, reviewing 3 decades of easement records, and identifying 2 that had been recorded incorrectly and needed correction. I submitted a formal compliance package to the state office in June of the following year. The property was added to the North Carolina Register of Historic Places the following spring. Roland sent me a card that said, "You see things carefully. That's the rarest thing. I keep it in my desk." We stayed in contact after the professional work was done. He was, in the uncomplicated way of certain very old people who have outlived the need to perform, exactly himself. No social management, no performance of warmth, just directness and dry humor, and a genuine interest in the things he was interested in, which included survey methodology, drainage systems, the history of Buncombe County land records, and, increasingly, me. He asked about my work in the specific way that tells you someone has actually listened to what you said last time. He called me once a month, which for Roland was frequent. My family knew I visited him occasionally. They thought of it vaguely as a professional connection I maintained out of politeness. Roland died in February, 3.5 years before my sister's wedding. He was 83. He left the Hartwell property to me, in full, with no conditions and no caveats, just a clean deed transfer, notarized and recorded at the Buncombe County Register of Deeds 2 weeks after his death, processed by the attorney who had drafted his will. The will contained a separate letter, sealed and addressed to me, which his attorney delivered with the deed documents. It said, in Roland's handwriting, which was the neat architectural print of a man who had spent his career making precise marks on paper, the property should belong to someone who understands what it is. You understand it. Take care of the boxwoods. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the attorney's office and read that letter 4 times. Then I drove to the property and walked the east garden and looked at the boxwoods, which needed a trim along the lower branch line, and made a note in my phone to call the groundskeeping contractor. My parents knew about the inheritance. I told them because not telling them would have been strange. My mother said it was very generous of Roland and that I should make sure to have the property properly insured, which is practical advice and also a way of not engaging with the size of what had happened. My father said it must be a lot of responsibility. Delia, when my mother mentioned it to her, reportedly said something like, "Oh wow," and moved on. None of them had ever been to the Hartwell property. None of them had asked about my work with Roland in any real detail. The inheritance registered in our family as a fact about me, not as a significant thing, the way most facts about me registered. I hired a property manager, a woman named Greta Hollis who had run event venue logistics for 15 years and understood historic properties and their particular requirements. I kept the seasonal events rental arrangement Roland had established, which generated enough income to cover the property's operating costs and maintenance with a modest surplus. I continued my day job. I drove out to the property on Saturday mornings sometimes and walked the grounds and checked on the boxwoods and thought about Roland's handwriting and what it means to be seen carefully by one person at the right time. 18 months after I took ownership of the property, Greta called me about an inquiry from an event planning company in Asheville that wanted to book the Hartwell grounds for a private wedding in September. It was a substantial booking, full-day exclusive use of the grounds and farmhouse for the ceremony and cocktail reception, with a formal dinner tent. The rental fee was $55,000 for the day, which was at the higher end of what we charged for full property exclusive use, and included the standard deposit structure. 30% up front, the balance due 30 days before the event. I approved the booking. Greta handled the contract. The deposit came in. I moved on. 3 weeks later, my mother called to tell me that my sister Delia was engaged to a man named Christopher Kingsley. I said congratulations and meant it. I did not, in that moment, make any connection between the two pieces of information. Why would I have? Delia and I didn't talk about her relationship in detail. I didn't know Christopher's family. I didn't know where they were planning to hold the ceremony. The connection arrived 7 weeks later, when Greta sent me the secondary event documentation for the September booking and I saw, on the bride's name line, the name Delia Voss. I stared at that document for a long moment. Then I called Greta and asked her to confirm the details. She confirmed. Delia Voss, marrying Christopher Kingsley, September 14th, full property exclusive use, Hartwell Estate. Deposit paid. Balance due in 6 weeks. My sister had booked her wedding at my property, through an events company, without, apparently, knowing it was mine. I thought about calling her immediately. I thought about it for about 30 seconds. Then I decided not to. Not from strategy, just from a genuine uncertainty about how to have the conversation, and a sense that there was time, and that it would resolve itself when it resolved itself. I was wrong about the time. Not about there being enough of it. About what would arrive before I used it. The phone call from Delia came on a Thursday morning, 8 weeks before the wedding. I was at my desk reviewing an easement file for a property in Henderson County. My phone lit up with her name, which was not unusual. She called every few weeks, usually to relay something our mother had said or to ask if I was coming home for a holiday. I answered in the ordinary way. She said, "Hey, I need to talk to you about something." I said okay. She said, "It's about the wedding. About the guest list and, well, about how things are going to be presented to Christopher's family." I waited. She said, "The Kingsleys they're a certain kind of family. Christopher's parents, his grandmother especially. They have very specific ideas about things. About how events should look and who's there, and the way the whole day comes across." She paused. "I've been thinking about this a lot, and I really believe it's the right call for the wedding specifically. Even if it's not, I know it might feel weird." I said, "What might feel weird?" She said, "I was hoping you might be willing to just at the wedding around the Kingsley family and their friends, just introduce yourself as a family friend rather than my sister. Just for the day. It's not about you, it's just that there's a lot of context with our family that's complicated to explain, and the Kingsleys have a certain image they're very protective of, and I think it would be smoother if." I said, "You want me to tell people we're not related?" She said, not in those words. Just if it comes up, just say you're a close family friend. It's not really lying, it's just." I said, "Delia." She stopped. I said, "What did Christopher's family say about me specifically?" A pause. Then, quieter. His grandmother asked about the guest list. She noticed our last name was the same and asked if we were sisters. I said yes. She asked what you did. I told her. She said. Delia stopped. I heard her exhale. She said she thought it might make things complicated. That their family events have a particular tone, and that having someone who works in, as she called it, a trade profession, at the immediate family table might affect the dynamic. I held the phone. Something in my chest went completely flat. like a room where someone has turned off all the sound. A trade profession. Historic property management and preservation compliance, reduced by a woman I had never met to a trade profession, and my sister had received that assessment and decided the correct response was to ask me to disappear from my own family. Delia said, "I know it's a lot to ask, but it's just one day. And it would mean so much to me to not have any friction with them going into the marriage. You know how these first impressions go." I said, "I'll think about it." She said, "Thank you, Miriam. Thank you. I really think it's the right move." After we hung up, I sat at my desk for a while without moving. The easement file was still open in front of me. I closed it. I looked out the window at the parking lot below, where a man in a yellow jacket was loading boxes into a truck with the patient efficiency of someone who has done the same task many times. I watched him until the truck drove away. Then I picked up my phone and called Greta. I asked her to pull the Hartwell booking file and tell me who had executed the vendor contract on the client side. Greta told me it was an events company called Whitmore Occasions. I asked whether there was any individual name on the signatory line. She said the signatory was a Christopher A. Kingsley, identified as the contracting party for the Kingsley-Voss wedding. I thanked her and told her I'd be in touch about a records matter. The next several weeks arrived with the particular density of a period in which you are waiting for something without quite knowing what you're waiting for. I went to work. I managed my properties. I drove to Hartwell on 2 Saturday mornings and checked the boxwoods. They were fine. The contractor had done a good trim, and walked the east garden and stood in the late summer light and thought about Roland's handwriting and about what it means to own something and be unknown inside it. My mother called the week after Delia's call. I had been expecting something, because Delia never makes a difficult request without prepping the field. My mother's version was gentler. She said she'd spoken to Delia about the wedding and she understood it was a lot to ask, but she hoped I'd be understanding, because the Kingsleys were an important family to Christopher and first impressions mattered, and sometimes you have to think about what's best for everyone as a whole. She said this carefully, with the particular phrasing of someone who has rehearsed. She said, "You know Delia loves you. She just needs this one thing." I said I understood. My father sent a text, which is his preferred medium for messages he doesn't want to defend in real time. It said, "Your mother tells me you're being gracious about the wedding situation. We appreciate it. You've always been the steady one." I read it twice and put my phone face down on the counter. The steady one. The family friend. The trade profession. The accommodation that everyone appreciated and no one examined. I called Greta on a Friday afternoon. I told her I needed to discuss the September booking. I explained, in the plainest possible terms, the situation. The bride was my sister. The booking had been made without my family knowing I owned the property, and I had recently been asked, by my family, to conceal my identity at the event. I told Greta I was not interested in canceling the booking. What I wanted was to ensure the property management documentation was accurate and accessible for day of operations, and that my role as owner was correctly reflected in whatever records the Whitmore Occasions team would be working from on the day. Greta was quiet for a moment. She has worked in event logistics long enough to have developed the particular composure of someone who has seen every possible version of a situation go sideways. She said, "So, you want to be identified correctly if a property authorization question comes up?" I said, "Yes, exactly that. If any decision requires owner authorization, any access issue, any change to the property use, anything that touches the deed, I want it routed to me." She said, "That's standard. Any property authorization goes to the owner. I'll make sure the day of file is current." I said, "I think I'll be on site." She said, "I'll add you to the site coordinator contacts." That was the entirety of what I arranged.
No cancelations. No threats.
No phone calls to vendors telling them to stand down. I updated a contact record and confirmed my own right to be present on my own property. The rest was paperwork being accurate. In the final week before the wedding, 3 things happened that told me the Kingsley family had not moderated their position. The first, Delia called to confirm I was still on board with the plan, which is how she phrased it. I said I'd be there. She said, "And you'll, do the thing we talked about." I said I'd see her at the property.
She took that as a yes.
The second, my mother called to say the Kingsley grandmother, a woman named Harriet Kingsley, whom I had still never met, had expressed relief that the family situation had been sorted out. I asked what that meant. My mother said Harriet had indicated she was glad the guest presentation was going to be clean. I said I was sure it would be. The third, Christopher Kingsley himself called me, which I had not expected. He called on a Wednesday evening and was polite in the precise, slightly stilted way of someone who is delivering a message he didn't draft. He said he wanted to thank me personally for being flexible about the day. He said his family valued certain traditions around formal events, and he hoped I understood it wasn't personal. He said, "Delia's lucky to have a sister who's so reasonable about things." I said, "I hope the day goes well." He said he appreciated it. After I hung up, something in my jaw went tight in a way I had to consciously release, standing alone in my kitchen at 8:30 on a Wednesday evening. I made tea. I drank it at the counter. Then I went to bed. The morning of the wedding was clear and warm in the particular way of September mornings in Asheville, the light arriving low and golden, the air still cool enough that you could feel it on your forearms before the day heated up. I drove to the Hartwell property at 7:15, 2.5 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. I had my site key on my keychain, as I always do. I parked at the owner's access point on the north side of the grounds, away from the main event entry, and walked through the east garden toward the farmhouse. The grounds were already in motion. The events team from Whitmore Occasions had begun their setup the previous afternoon, and by 7:30 the ceremony seating was arranged in the south garden, rows of white chairs facing the low stone wall where the couple would stand, flanked by arrangements of late summer florals. The catering tent was positioned on the east lawn, and the tent crew was running final checks on the structure. Greta was at the farmhouse steps with her clipboard and her site phone, coordinating with 3 other members of her management team. She saw me cross the garden and came to meet me at the garden gate.
She said, "Morning.
Everything's on schedule. The floral team will finish by 9. Catering setup is ahead by about 20 minutes. I said, "Good. Anything I need to know?" She said, "One thing." She handed me a printed copy of the Day of Property authorization sheet, a single page, the owner's name at the top, the site protocols below, the emergency contact column on the right. My name was on the first line, followed by the legal address of the Hartwell property and the deed reference number. The Whitmore coordinator asked me yesterday who had final authority on any property use decisions today. I told her the owner. She asked for the name. I gave it to her. I said, "All right." Greta said, "She may have mentioned it to the Kingsley family contact." I said, "All right." I thanked her and walked to the farmhouse and let myself in through the owner's entrance. I made coffee in the farmhouse kitchen, which has a window that looks out over the east garden. I stood at that window with my mug and watched the property wake up. The florists moving through the rows adjusting arrangements, the catering team unloading from their truck, the morning light moving across the boxwood hedges along the east wall. The boxwoods looked good. The contractor had done excellent work. Guests began arriving at 9:40. The ceremony was set for 10. I had positioned myself near the farmhouse's rear terrace, which has a partial sight line to the main guest arrival area and the garden path that led to the ceremony seating. I was not hiding. I was standing in a corner of my own property, holding a coffee cup, wearing a gray dress I had bought in July for a preservation conference, and not worn yet. The first Kingsley vehicles arrived in a convoy, 3 black cars from a hotel downtown, which was what the charter service did when they were moving an organized group. The Kingsley family emerged in clusters. Christopher first, with 2 men I understood to be his brothers, then a group of 6 or 7 older relatives, then a woman in her late 70s or early 80s moving with deliberate slowness and a posture that communicated, without words, that she was the organizational center of the group. Harriet Kingsley. She was small and upright and wore pale lavender, and she surveyed the grounds as she entered them the way a person surveys something they believe they have arranged and paid for. She had arranged it. She had paid for it. Through an events company, on grounds she had never inquired about beyond their aesthetic. My family arrived 20 minutes later, my parents and my mother's sister and her husband. My mother saw me immediately and crossed to the terrace. She touched my arm and said, quietly, with a particular careful brightness, "You look lovely. You remember, you know." She made a small tilting gesture with her head toward the Kingsley group. I looked at her for a moment. Something in my chest that had been wound tight for 3 weeks went very still, not released, just still, the way a mechanism goes still when it has finished storing what it was asked to store. I said, "I remember, Mom." She patted my arm and moved toward my father. At 9:54, the Whitmore Occasions site coordinator, a tall woman in a dark blazer named Simone, whom I had spoken to once by phone, came through the garden gate and made her way toward the farmhouse terrace, where Greta was positioned. She had a tablet in one hand and a property folder in the other. She stopped at Greta, they exchanged a few words, and then Simone looked across the terrace at me. She crossed to me directly. She said, "Ms. Voss? I'm Simone, site coordinator for Whitmore. I wanted to introduce myself before the ceremony started. Greta confirmed you as the property owner yesterday. I like to meet the owner on the day if possible, in case anything comes up that needs an authorization call." She said it in the clean, matter-of-fact way of a professional confirming a standard protocol. She had no reason to know that the word owner had just landed in a garden full of Kingsley relatives like a stone in a still pond. I said, "Nice to meet you. I'm glad you're running a tight ship." She smiled, nodded, and turned to address the 3 members of her team who had gathered nearby. She said, to them, in the carrying voice of a coordinator briefing her staff, "Just confirming for the team, Ms. Miriam Voss is the property owner for the Hartwell estate. Any access decisions, any property use questions, anything that requires an authorization call goes to her or Greta directly. She's on site all day." My full name, in my own garden, in front of approximately 30 people, including Harriet Kingsley, who had turned from her conversation with her son and was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on a stranger's face before, a very specific combination of recalibration and the particular affront of someone whose understanding of a situation has just been revised without their permission. The garden went quiet in the particular way of outdoor spaces when people stop their small conversations at the same moment. The ambient noise, the birds, the catering team at the far end of the lawn, continued without interruption. But the human sound in the immediate area simply ceased. Christopher Kingsley had also turned. He was standing 15 feet from me, in his morning coat, and the color in his face had shifted in a way that reminded me of paper getting wet, a slow, visible change, moving from the jaw up. My sister was still inside the farmhouse in the bridal suite. She did not hear this. That is the only mercy in the sequence. Simone, who had not noticed or did not register the shift in the air around her, went on with her briefing for another 30 seconds and then dismissed her team and moved on to her next item. She is very good at her job. I stood on my own terrace and held my coffee cup and looked at the boxwood hedges. The thing I need you to understand about what I had done, or rather what I had not done, is that I had not staged anything. I want to be precise about this because I think precision matters, and because the version of the story that makes me a villain requires me to have engineered a public humiliation, and I did not do that. I updated a contact record. I confirmed my right to be present on my property. I told Greta to ensure the day of authorization sheet was accurate. The rest was Simone doing her job correctly in a garden with people in it. The validation arrived in stages, because real consequences arrive in stages. The first stage was Harriet Kingsley. She crossed the terrace toward me 10 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. She moved carefully, with the deliberateness of a woman who has decided to have a conversation and is not going to be deterred from it. She stopped in front of me and looked at me with direct, assessing eyes and said, without preamble, "You're the owner of this property." I said, "Yes." She said, "Miriam Voss." I said, "Yes." She said, "Delia's sister." I said, "Yes." A pause. She looked at me the way she had looked at the grounds when she arrived, taking inventory. She said, "We were not informed that the property had a private owner. We understood it to be a commercial venue." I said, "It's privately owned. Has been for about 3 years." She said, "And you are Delia's sister." I said, "I am." Another pause, longer. Something in the set of her mouth shifted, a compression, and then a release. She said, "I see." 2 words, carrying approximately 40 years of social experience in them. She said, "I believe we may have been given incomplete information about several things." I said, "That's possible." She said, "Are you intending to disrupt today's event?" I said, "No. I want my sister to have a good wedding." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "I owe you an apology. My comments about your profession were not made with full information, and they were not kind regardless." She said it with the particular precision of a woman who does not apologize frequently and therefore does it correctly when she does. "I am sorry for that." I said, "I appreciate you saying so." She nodded once. Then she said, "The property is beautiful." She looked across the east garden, at the boxwood hedges and the September light and the rows of white chairs below. She said, "Someone has cared for it." I said, "Someone did. A man named Roland. I'm trying to continue what he started."
She looked at me.
Something in her face changed, not softened exactly, but reconsidered. She said, "I'd like to speak with you more after the ceremony." I said, "Of course." She turned and went back to her family. The ceremony began at 10:12, 12 minutes behind schedule, which is practically on time. I watched from the terrace as the guests settled into the rows of white chairs, as the string quartet in the corner of the garden moved into the processional, as my father walked Delia down the garden path between the rows. She looked beautiful in the particular way of people who are happy at a specific moment, not performed beauty but the kind that arrives from inside a good feeling and works its way outward. I stayed on the terrace. I did not sit in the rows. I had not been invited to sit in the rows, and I did not insert myself where I had not been invited. Christopher stood at the stone wall and watched Delia come toward him, and his face did the thing I had noticed at the ceremony preview. It opened up, became less managed, became simply a person looking at something they're glad exists. Whatever he is or isn't, he loves my sister. I let that be true and uncomplicated. They were married at 10:49. The guests applauded. A bird in the oak tree at the property's western edge made an extended comment on the proceedings. Someone laughed. The string quartet played something cheerful. I went inside and got more coffee. The validation continued during the cocktail hour, which was held on the east lawn while the tent was being finished for the reception dinner. Christopher came to find me at 11:30. He was still in his morning coat, holding a champagne flute, and he had the specific expression of a man who has recently had a conversation with his grandmother and is arriving slightly altered from how he left. He said, "My grandmother told me." I said, "About the property?" He said, "About all of it." He looked at his champagne flute briefly, then back at me. "I didn't know this was your property when we booked it. I want you to know that." I said, "I believe you." He said, "And I didn't know. I wasn't fully aware of what my grandmother had said about the things she said. About your profession." He said it carefully. "That wasn't something I endorse." I said, "Okay." He said, "I'm also aware that I called you and thanked you for being understanding about a situation that wasn't fair to you." I said, "You did." He said, "I'm sorry for that." He meant it in the way young men mean things when they have just understood something they should have understood earlier. I received it as such. I said, "Take care of my sister." He said, "I will." He went back to his family. Delia found me at 12:15 between the cocktail hour and the start of the reception dinner. She had been told, by Christopher, I later understood, who had told her immediately after our conversation and then given her 20 minutes to come find me herself. She came around the corner of the farmhouse to the terrace where I was standing, and she stopped a few feet away, and she looked at me with an expression I had seen on her face before but not often, stripped of the management she usually brings to difficult conversations, just the face underneath. She said, "Miriam." I said, "Hey." She said, "This is your property." I said, "Yes." She said, "You've owned it for 3 years." I said, "Almost 3.5. Her hands had come together in front of her, fingers interlaced. Her chin moved in a way that took me a moment to read. It was the gesture she makes when she's trying not to let something show in her face. She said, "I asked you to pretend you were a stranger. On your own property." I said, "You didn't know." She said, "I asked you to pretend we weren't sisters." I said, "Yes." The silence between us had a texture, not hostile, just full. The way a room feels full before someone opens a window. She said, "I don't have a way to explain that makes it okay." I said, "No."
She said, "I'm sorry. I'm genuinely sorry, Miriam."
Not for the property thing, for all of it. For the way I've always just assumed you'd absorb whatever I needed from you and be fine. And you always were fine. And I think I stopped thinking about whether that was fair. It was the most honest thing she had said to me in years. Maybe ever. I received it carefully, the way you receive something fragile. I said, "I know." She said, I want to do better. I want to actually be sisters." I said, "I'd like that." She looked at me for a moment. Then she stepped forward and put her arms around me, which is something Delia does infrequently and therefore means something when she does it. I put my hand on her back. We stood in the September light on Roland's terrace, and my sister cried very quietly into my shoulder, and I let her, and I held the thing carefully. After a moment, she straightened and wiped her face with the back of her hand and said, "I ruined my makeup." I said, "You were already married. The photos are done." She laughed, a real one, surprised out of her, and the tension went out of her shoulders, and for a few seconds she looked like the version of herself I remembered from when we were children, before we became the shapes our family made of us. The cascade came quietly, the way real consequences come when the situation is built on paperwork rather than performance. The most immediate effect was on Harriet Kingsley's behavior for the remainder of the day. She arrived that morning as the acknowledged center of the event's social gravity, the grandmother who had shaped the guest presentation, who had made the comment about trade professions, who had received reassurance from my family that the situation had been managed. She left the morning as a woman who had learned she had been a guest, with her family, on another woman's private property, a property she had assessed without inquiry, on grounds she had walked without permission, in a garden maintained by someone she had dismissed without knowing. She did not become unpleasant. I want to be accurate. Harriet Kingsley is a woman of deep social formation, and that formation includes a genuine code about grace and difficulty. She circulated at the cocktail hour. She was kind to the guests. She gave a warm toast at the dinner that made several people cry in the good way. But she also came to find me 3 separate times during the afternoon, and each time the conversation was different. The first time was after the ceremony, which I've told you about. The second was during the cocktail hour, when she brought her son, Christopher's father, a tall, quiet man named Edmund, and introduced us with the particular deliberateness of someone correcting a record. She said, "Edmund, this is Miriam Voss, Delia's sister. She owns the Hartwell property." Edmund shook my hand with the grip of a man who has just understood he has been imprecise about something and is correcting it. He said he understood I worked in historic property management. I said yes. He asked, with what seemed like genuine interest, how I'd come to own the Hartwell grounds. I told him about Roland, briefly, the way you tell a story that belongs to someone you loved. Edmund listened carefully. He said, "That's a remarkable inheritance." He said it about Roland's trust in me, not about the acreage. The third conversation with Harriet was at the end of the afternoon, as guests were beginning to move toward their cars. She came to the terrace alone. She said, "I want to ask you something, and I hope you'll receive it in the spirit it's meant."
I said I'd try.
She said, "My comments about your profession. They were based on, I'm going to be honest with you, they were based on Delia's description of your work, which I now understand was incomplete, and on certain assumptions I carry that I'm not proud of."
She paused.
I should have asked more questions before I formed opinions. I didn't. That's a failure of mine. I said, "I appreciate you saying that." She said, "I'm also aware that you had every reason to disrupt today's event and chose not to." She looked at me steadily. That was generous. I said, "I wanted my sister to have a good wedding." She said, "Yes." I know. She looked across the east garden at the now empty ceremony chairs, at the boxwoods along the wall, at the light moving across the lawn. She said, "This is a beautiful property. The care in it is visible." I said, "A man named Roland Voss cared for it for 40 years. I'm trying to honor that." She said, "You're doing well by it." She shook my hand, a formal gesture, the kind that means something when it comes from someone like Harriet Kingsley, and walked back to her family. My parents were the harder conversation, and it came 2 days after the wedding, not during it. My father called on a Monday evening. He said the Hartwell property had come up in a conversation with my mother, and they wanted to talk. He said it with the careful tone of a man approaching a subject he should have approached sooner. He said, "We didn't know the property you inherited from Roland was the Hartwell estate." I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "Delia didn't know either." I said, "I know." He said, "We should have known. We should have asked more about your work, about what Roland left you." He was quiet for a moment. "We treat your life like a backdrop sometimes. I think we have for a long time. And that's not something I can fix with one phone call, but I want you to know that I see it." My father is not a man who says that kind of thing. I sat with it for a moment before I answered. I said, "That means something to me." He said, "We're proud of you, Miriam. I don't know if we say that in a way that lands." I said, "Not always." He said, "I'd like to work on that." I said, "I'd like that too." My mother called the next day and cried, which she does when she's moved and doesn't know what to do with it. She said she wanted to visit the property sometime, if I'd show her. I said I would. She said she wanted to hear more about Roland. I said I'd tell her. The financial dimension of the aftermath was small in one direction and significant in another. Greta called me the week after the wedding to report that the Whitmore Occasions coordinator had received a call from Edmund Kingsley asking about the possibility of booking the Hartwell property for a family event the following summer. Edmund had apparently mentioned, in the course of that call, that he'd been introduced to the owner and found the property exceptionally well maintained. The inquiry was routed to me through Greta, per standard protocol. I reviewed the calendar and confirmed we had the date available. I sent the standard inquiry package, property overview, pricing structure, event guidelines, deposit schedule. Edmund's assistant responded within 2 days. The event booked at the standard rate. The deposit came in the following week. Harriet Kingsley also sent a note. It arrived on cream stationery in a proper envelope, handwritten in the small, precise script of a woman who writes letters as a deliberate act rather than an obligation. It said, "Miss Voss, I hope in time we may know each other properly. What you have preserved at Hartwell is worth preserving. The boxwoods are exceptional."
Haka.
I read it standing at my kitchen counter. Then I put it in the drawer with Roland's letter and with the note from my aunt about seeing things carefully, and I stood for a moment with my hand on the drawer before I closed it. I drove to the property that Saturday morning, walked the east garden, checked the boxwoods, made a note in my phone that the south hedge needed attention along the lower branch line. Then I went home and made breakfast and thought about what Roland would have said about all of it and decided he probably would have said something dry and brief and precisely correct and left it at that. I've turned the story over many times trying to find the right word for what happened, and the word I keep arriving at is accuracy. Not justice. Not revenge. Accuracy. My name was on the deed. It had been on the deed for 3.5 years. The only thing that changed on that Saturday morning was that the people in the garden learned to read the document correctly. That's all. The property didn't change. I didn't change. The boxwoods didn't change. The record was always accurate. The people just hadn't looked at it. Roland spent 38 years as a land surveyor because he believed that knowing exactly where the lines are matters. That the careful record is the true record. That what's on the paper is what's real, regardless of what anyone assumed.
He was right.
He was almost always right. Take care of what you own. Keep the paper. And remember that the ground you're standing on has a name on it, and eventually, everyone finds out whose name it is. That's my story. A title deed, a day of authorization sheet, and a coordinator who reads from her file. Before you go, I want to ask you something real. Have you ever owned something, a skill, A resource, a piece of history, a piece of yourself that the people closest to you had completely failed to see? Not because it was hidden, but because they had never thought to look? And if you have, what happened when they finally saw it? Did it change things? Did it change them? Did it change you? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know.